My friends, as the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, is regrouping for a massive counter-offensive against Hamas, even though we're only at day 6 of the fighting, I think we can already draw some conclusions. So here are some military lessons of the Israel-Hamas war. My friends, what happened in Israel is unacceptable. I'm still in disbelief of the barbaric actions of Hamas. I think nobody expected how far they would be ready to go. My thoughts and prayers to the people of Be'eri. Long story short, the catastrophic events that unfolded over the weekend was a display of how unprepared even such a strong army as the IDF can be against a couple hundreds of determined and well-prepared terrorists. So the first obvious lesson is to never underestimate your enemy. Tzahal, the armed forces of Israel, clearly thought their longtime enemy to be incapable of such an offensive. Even Egypt warned Israel, and Israel rejected the advice. Achi, why didn't you listen? It was also foolish to think that Palestinian forces of HMS could not become as lethal as their Lebanese counterparts of HZB in terms of manpower, tactics, and equipment. The Palestinians learned and simply leveled up. They went from throwing rocks to throwing hundreds of missiles. They went from making homemade hummus to an entire arsenal of homemade weapons, like the Mubar 1 air defense unguided rockets, the 114mm Rajum short-range missile system. We also know that they made use of Cornet anti-tank missiles, and they even have their own Al-Zawari kamikaze drones. Just like the HZB did in Lebanon, they built countless tunnels and underground firing positions for cover.
Oh shit, here we go again.
We also have to discuss the evident weaknesses of Israel's intelligence services. Oh wow, Mossad here, Mossad there, with all their Netflix documentaries, Fauda, all their technology, surveillance systems, their drones. How come they didn't see what was coming? They will know about the kinky things I'm sending out, but not about concentrations of enemy troops about to invade them. At the same time, HMS did everything to stay on the low in the past months and years. And like that, para, they prepared their attack in the shadows. In August 2022 and again in May 2023, there were clashes between Israel and the Palestinian IJ faction in Gaza. But Hamas stood on the side, giving a false impression to Israel that the group was becoming moderate. This upsec and seeming compliance by HMS in Gaza led Israeli intelligence to focus their attention somewhere else. For example, in the north of the country near the Lebanese border against HZB. This threat was confirmed in May 2023 when HZB staged military exercises and war games aimed at Israel. And I heard that because of this, a good number of IDF forces were redeployed from the south to the north. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Israel-Palestine war. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my videos have been targeted with limited or no ads, just like the last one. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped. And welcome to the headquarters. I think that the most important lesson for the West, and that they should take very seriously, is just how much damage a well-organized group of insurgents can inflict with rudimentary military equipment they can buy on the black market. The Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, was outplayed by just a couple hundreds of guys equipped with AK-47s, various heavy machine guns like the PKM or the Type 80, RPGs. Some of those were upgraded with PG-7VR tandem charge warheads to penetrate hardened structures. But long story short, there's nothing crazy about these light infantry weapons. Those are pretty standard for insurgents all over the world. Even tractors were used to break defenses and open up paths. We also saw the use of many mortars of all sizes, and often very well camouflaged. In terms of troop transports, they mostly use motorcycles, countless pickups, and various civilian cars. And with that, they achieved a budget-friendly Blitzkrieg. Toyota, they do make very good vehicles. Anyway, that's also how the Palestinians got their hands on multiple MILFs, or Motorized Infantry Light Force. I promise you it sounds better in Arabic. There's a video of one of these MILF units with 6 pickups with each 4 to 5 infantrymen just roaming around the countryside. Right there, that's about a platoon of 30 fighters. And they had dozens of those. Moments later, they were dismounted and we see them push forward towards the enemy, where they then split up in small fire teams of 5 to 6 men, which then allowed them to encircle Israeli compounds from multiple directions. Nothing of this is new. But what they achieved was only possible with a high level of structure and organization. Just like in Ukraine, HMS officers had a command center that had dozens of drones in the air. And that's how they coordinated every unit during the attack on a tactical level in real time. And we all saw the importance of drones, UAVs in Ukraine. Yet enemy drones could freely fly over the lines of the #1 army of the Middle East. They flew right above armored vehicles, various guard towers, automatic machine gun turrets, radio stations, everything along the border. They dropped their load on it. More and more insurgents across the world are now using grenade-dropping drones. How come the IDF did not adapt to this growing threat? How come Tzahal did not have any electronic warfare assets active? Where were all the drone jammers? There were absolutely no countermeasures for the guys on the ground against these UAVs. Even now, when I see images of Israeli troops preparing their counteroffensive, there's absolutely no anti-drone protection, and all the vehicles are parked side by side in open ground. They clearly learned nothing from the war in Ukraine. Now we have to admit that such low-tech forces are perfect for guerrilla warfare, but they would get shredded in conventional war. So the follow-up military lesson is the importance of the surprise effect during an offensive. We cannot quantify it, but the shock factor has its significance. For example, the moment Ukraine announced to the entire world when and where they would strike, they completely threw away this crucial factor. So when the Palestinian troops in Gaza launched Operation Al-Aqsa Floods on October 7th, nobody saw it coming. Clearly, preparations for this attack have been years in the making, and the Palestinians came up with new ways to bypass Israeli defensive measures, instead of using tunnels to infiltrate its fighters deep into Israeli territory. This time they brought their demolition squads just behind the fences and walls, and that bypassed any vibration detectors that would just start at the border. In order to breach the first layer of defense, they also used speedboats right along the beaches and disembarked entire units right on the shores of Ashkelon, a major city of 130,000 inhabitants. And at the same time, they also sent entire teams of motorized paragliders to move even more troops behind this barrier wall, but also very far inland. For example, to reach the Re'im base, 5 kilometers from the border of Gaza, these motorized paragliders would only need about 13 minutes. And the fact that they fly slowly right above the tree line makes them almost immune to Israel's air defense capabilities. How do you think people reacted when they saw those Marines disembark in Ashkelon, or those paragliders deep inside Israel's territory, apart from the human cost? In other disasters that we can suppose the Palestinians captured very important communications equipment, such as radios and various encoders. This is very problematic for the IDF because they heavily rely on technology alone. So HMS struck right where it hurts. According to the casualty reports, they even managed to attack the positions of the 947th Missile Defense Battalion, aka a unit of the Iron Dome. They destroyed all the radio towers and observation points along the border, thus leaving the Israeli defense blind to their movements. And as you can imagine, this increased the shock factor. Even the automatic turrets could not function properly. That's how entire Palestinian columns just poured into the breach. Now, on the morning of October 7th, when the central Israeli HQ received all the reports of the attack, you can imagine the panic. They must have thought they got overwhelmed by thousands and thousands of enemies. All of a sudden, Palestinians were reported everywhere, at this place, that one, and that one as well. And this probably paralyzed the entire chain of command, which preferred to keep all its reserves at the rear, pull back all the troops for defensive positions instead of ordering a rapid counterattack. So that's how a couple hundreds of insurgents outplayed the IDF. The surprise effect allowed them to get face to face with the Israelis at close range and thus negate the Israeli advantage in firepower and in armored vehicles. And as you can imagine, this also makes airstrikes very complicated. We have to talk about the omnipresence of combat footage from the Palestinian perspective, which is completely new. From all the videos I've seen, roughly 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 Palestinian fighters was equipped with a GoPro, and they use all these videos as a propaganda tool to expand the scale of their attack, to show their successes to the entire world. And if you flood the internet with enough videos, you will even be able to give the impression to your enemy that he's losing the battle. And this will affect his mental state. And once again, it will push the opponent to act a certain way, and not necessarily what's best for him. Another obvious conclusion I could draw from all the footage I've analyzed is the importance of proper training. We saw it in Ukraine, and we're seeing it now. One IDF veteran told me that the Israeli military has a life-size copy of the town of Jenin to the dot. And this is where they train their troops, their conscripts, for urban warfare. And overall, from what I've been told, the training of conscripts in Israel is pretty good. Of course, there are differences from one unit to another, but generally speaking, it's at the top. However, I feel that since the Israelis are so used to be on the offensive, that their troops are probably not that familiar in fighting from a defensive standpoint. And especially not without GPS, communication tools, air support. So yeah, the attack on the IDF bases was brutal, to say the least. I saw all the footage, and I'm telling you, it's not for the faint-hearted. And according to some reports, most of the defenders were still in bed when it all happened. And when you look at the list of the fallen IDF soldiers that were deployed along the Gaza border that day, the average age was around 23, but the median age was 20 to 21. So most of them must have been conscripts, young Israeli males going through military service. Yeah, I know girls also go through military service, but for the most part, all they do is TikTok videos. And because it took place during Shabbat, there must have been a rotation, and many went home to see family and friends. So we can assume that the ones that stayed behind were the young ones with no combat experience, or the troublemakers. I've been told the story of a 10-man unit that was in one of these bases. It was commanded by a lieutenant fresh out of the military academy, but he was a newbie with no combat experience. And that morning, when the fireworks went off, and shit hit the fan, and 3 of his guys were down outside the building, he panicked and froze. And the other guys didn't know what to do. So in the ensuing chaos, they just ran away. These Israeli soldiers on base were clearly not prepared for such an event. There are also cases where tank hatches were open. From one video I saw, there was a tank commander clearly outside the tank. Why? I'm not a tank expert. Maybe their optics were down, or simply because all their communication tools were down and they were completely lost. After the initial breach, some Merkava tanks did arrive in reinforcement, and they immediately went into hold-down position, just like they have been taught. A position where you only see the turret of the tank. And this is excellent against enemy vehicles. However, this is highly ineffective against an infantry force, especially when you, as a tank crew, you have no infantry support on your flanks. I don't blame these tank crews in the middle of chaos. Who could blame them? However, I'm very critical about their instructors, and that's how a 10-man strong anti-tank squad equipped with RPGs ended up swarming these Israeli Merkavas and just fired their rockets at point blank. I don't want to go too much in details, but bad stuff happened in the bases. At one of these compounds after the initial attack, the Israeli survivors regrouped. I counted roughly 40 IDF troops. I can't imagine in what psychological state these conscripts must have been in, but from the images I saw, they seemed disoriented. There was no actual tactical formation. They were all grouped up. Perhaps the officers were all KIA. Perhaps the building with the officers was a primary target of the enemy. I don't know. But it's clear that these guys were pinned down by a combination of mortar fire and drones. And that's the thing, Israeli soldiers are taught a huge array of tactics and maneuvers to face as many situations as possible. Meanwhile, Palestinian stormtroopers trained for only one mission. They trained on real-size mock-ups of Israeli bases, and they simply repeated the same tactics over and over again. I mean, look at that. They built fake guard towers and gates, monitored everything using drones, but they also trained on replicas of armored vehicles like the M113 and the Merkava tank. Bruv, they even trained on Cornet anti-tank missile simulators. Same thing for their engineering units, whose job was crucial as it was to open up breaches along the main wall. Well, they also went through this repetitive training on real-life size reconstructions of the Gaza border wall. Meanwhile, to maintain operational secrecy, we can believe the Palestinian fighters were not told any information outside of their scope for their tactical mission. This is probably why many were handed out leaflets on the day of the attack for visual identification of enemy vehicles and their weak points. These guys probably thought they would be sent to Lebanon, Faraya, party, but no, fire across Gaza. According to the Times of Israel, the toll of the Israeli military amounts to 247, most of which we can assume happened on the first day or even in the first hours of the attack. Thoughts and prayers to their family and friends. But just so you can compare the scale of this disaster. In 2006, during the month-long Israeli incursion into southern Lebanon, the IDF suffered 121 KIA. It was reported that on the Nahal Oz base alone, the Israelis lost 4 Merkava tanks, 14 Namer infantry fighting vehicles, 7 tracked armored personnel carriers like the M113, 3 bulldozers, and a huge number of vehicles. Most of these vehicles are now in Gaza. And you can be sure that with all these vehicles, they're gonna study them millimeter by millimeter. How many of these vehicles do you think could be used to lay ambushes on Israeli troops within the Gaza Strip once the counteroffensive starts? And lastly, let's talk about the political impact. Operation Al-Aqsa Flood had multiple military objectives, like breaking the border, capturing military bases and all that. But like any insurgency movement, it also had many political goals. For example, Sderot, a town of 30,000 inhabitants, had completely fallen to the enemy. Hey chat, when was the last time Israel had lost control of a big town like Sderot?
As of my last knowledge update in September 2021, Israel had not lost control of a town with at least 30,000 inhabitants in its history.
When was the last time that enemy troops set foot in Ashkelon? And within the scope falls all the atrocities, all the brutal terror attacks against Israeli civilians. The way you have to see it is a bit like in football. There's this one guy behind you that keeps shoving you, and then little elbow here, little elbow there, just to push you to respond disproportionately in front of everyone for you to get sanctioned. So let's see what the Israeli counteroffensive will bring. Now the situation is that there are many captured Israeli POWs in Palestinian hands, plus all the civilian hostages. We're talking about 100 people, and they're now deep within the Gaza Strip, and it's a big problem. And such action was made deliberately to slow down the margin of maneuver of the IDF. And we can be sure that Palestinians are already awaiting round 2. They're most likely already preparing their positions inside Gaza. According to this map, the Shuja'iyya district alone has countless tunnels, hideouts, and combat positions. And this map dates back from a couple years ago. On round 1, the Palestinians flipped the script and struck an unprepared Israeli army. And now they want to drag these troops into a more favorable terrain, aka urban warfare, filled with civilians. The entire Gaza Strip has roughly 2.3 million inhabitants. No matter what Israel does at this point, it will be messy. And now all the soldiers of the Israeli military, all the reservists that were called back, are understandably extremely mad, and they want revenge. They said it many times. How do you think they will act inside Gaza? And while all this is taking place, we have also the Lebanese HZB that is very active in the north of Israel. The West Bank is also brewing. The conflict could become much greater than we think. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.